The rain in Seattle doesn't just fall, it haunts. It's a persistent gray weight that settles into your bones until you forget what the sun even feels like. Standing there at the edge of my father's open grave, that weight felt like it was finally going to crush my chest. My father was a man of dirt and calluses, a man who built an empire out of scrap metal and sheer stubborn will. He deserved a moment of silence. But as the last handful of North Cloud soil hit the mahogany lid of his casket, the silence wasn't broken by a prayer. It was broken by the sharp, rhythmic click of heels on wet pavement. Tatum stepped forward, looking like she had stepped off a runway rather than into a cemetery. Her black veil was lace expensive and draped perfectly over her shoulders. She didn't say, "I'm sorry for your loss," or "I'm here for you." She reached into her designer clutch, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and pressed it against my chest. "It's over, Nash," she said, her voice as cold as the rain. 15 years is a long time to play house, but the lease just expired. I looked down at the envelope. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Today. Tatum right here. She let out a dry, melodic laugh that made my skin crawl. Why wait? The timing is poetic, actually. Now that he's under 6 feet of mud, the paperwork we filed months ago is finally cleared. Every acre, every account, every cent of the North Cloud estate is legally mine now. You're not just losing a wife today, Nash. You're losing everything. I felt a ghost of a sensation in my gut. Not quite pain, more like a profound, hollow realization. My father had warned me. I had defended her for a decade and a half. I had built a life on the foundation of her loyalty, only to realize the foundation was made of shifting sand. "The kids," I managed to say, my voice raspy. "Where are they?" Tatum stepped aside, and that's when I saw them. Beckett and Lennox were standing by a black SUV idling 50 yards away. They weren't wearing mourning clothes. My heart already fractured, shattered completely. I walked toward them, my shoes sinking into the mud. "Beckett, Lennox," I called out. Beckett didn't even look up from his phone. He just leaned against the car door, his expression one of pure disdain. Lennox, only 12, but already possessing her mother's icy stare, was the one who spoke. "Don't Nash," she said. "Not Dad. Just Nash. We already talked about this with Mom and Callum. We're moving into the new place tonight, and before you ask, we've already signed the papers to change our surnames. We're going to be Vaughns now. It's Callum's name, a name that actually means something in this city." I stopped in my tracks. Callum Vaughn, my former business partner, the man I had pulled out of bankruptcy 5 years ago. "You're changing your names," I whispered. "I'm your father. Everything I did for you." Beckett finally looked at me, and the hatred in his eyes was a physical blow. "You were never for us. You were for the business. Callum actually sees us. He's taking us to Europe next month. You're just a ghost, Nash. Today just makes it official." Tatum walked over to the SUV, her hand trailing over the polished chrome. "Don't bother coming back to the house," she said, her voice projecting so everyone could hear. "The locks were changed an hour ago. Your things are in garbage bags at the end of the driveway." She climbed into the passenger seat. Callum, I could see his silhouette behind the steering wheel, now didn't even have the decency to look me in the eye. As they pulled away, the tires kicked up a spray of dirty slush that coated my suit. I stood there alone. The cemetery staff began to move in with their shovels. One of them, an older man named Elias, who had known my father for years, walked up. "You okay, son?" he asked softly. "I'm fine, Elias," I said. And for the first time in a decade, I wasn't lying. I turned away from the grave. I walked to my old 1994 Ford, the only thing I owned that wasn't tied to the North Cloud corporate entity. I sat there for a long time watching the rain wash the cemetery mud off my windshield. My phone buzzed a notification from the bank. My personal account, the one Tatum hadn't found yet, was enough to disappear. I drove straight to a motel on the edge of the county line. I checked in under a different name. I took out my laptop and opened a file I hadn't looked at in months. It was the real ledger of North Cloud scrap and logistics, the one my father had handed me on his deathbed with a wink and a raspy whisper. Let them think they've won, Nash. Greed always skips the fine print. I spent the next 6 days in that room. Tatum thought she had taken the gold mine. She didn't realize she had actually seized a sinking ship with a hull made of debt and federal red tape. By forcing me out and claiming sole ownership, she had effectively signed a confession of liability for every penny. On the 7th day, the screen lit up. It was a call from Lennox. I let it ring 3 times before I picked up. Nash. Nash, are you there? Lennox's voice was stripped of its icy confidence. There are men here, in suits. They're putting yellow tape around the house. They told Mom she has to leave. They're taking the cars, Nash. Mom is screaming at Callum and he's just packing a bag. He said this isn't what he signed up for. I leaned back against the headboard. That sounds like a complicated situation, Lennox. Why didn't you tell us? She sobbed. We don't have anywhere to go. You chose your side, Lennox, I said, my voice steady. You told me I was a ghost, and ghosts don't pay the bills. Go live with your mother. Go live with the name you wanted so badly. I hung up. I stood up, grabbed my keys, and walked toward the door. The cheap metal handle of the motel door felt biting against my palm, a stark contrast to the stagnant, heated air inside the room. As I stepped onto the gravel lot, the sudden clarity of the Washington afternoon hit me like a physical weight. The sky wasn't just clear. It was an aggressive, piercing blue that felt almost insulting after the week I'd spent in the shadows. My boots crunched against the stones, each step echoing the finality of the call I'd just ended. Lennox's voice, the terror, the sudden realization of her own vulnerability still vibrated in my inner ear, but it didn't trigger the instinctual protective surge I'd lived by for over a decade. That man, the one who would have jumped into the fire to save them from a singe, had stayed behind in the mud of the cemetery. I climbed into the Ford, the engine groaning before settling into its familiar rhythmic rumble. I didn't have a destination yet, just a direction away. As I pulled onto the main road, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. The lines around my eyes seemed deeper etched by the silent warfare of the last 7 days, but the frantic energy that usually buzzed under my skin was gone. I was a man with no home, no family, and no title. And yet I had never felt more like the owner of my own life. I drove toward the coast, watching the landscape shift from the suburban sprawl of my former life into the rugged, untamed beauty of the shoreline. My mind, free from the constant noise of Tatum's demands, and the kid's entitlement began to stitch together the memories of the last few years. I realized now that the betrayal hadn't started at the funeral. It had been a slow-motion car crash, one I had spent years trying to ignore. I remembered the nights I'd spent at the yard until 2 a.m. calculating margins and negotiating shipping contracts, only to come home to a house where the lights were off, and my dinner was a cold plate left on the counter like an afterthought. I remembered the look on Tatum's face 3 years ago when I'd told her we needed to scale back on the country club memberships to reinvest in the new environmental filtration systems my father wanted. She hadn't argued. She had just looked through me, her eyes already scanning the room for something or someone more profitable. That was likely the moment she had reached out to Callum. He was everything I wasn't: polished corporate and perfectly willing to build a life on top of someone else's ruins. I pulled into a small, weathered diner overlooking the Pacific. The sign swung precariously in the salt-heavy breeze, its neon humming a lonely tune. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee and fried hash browns, the kind of honest, unpretentious scent that made the polished marble of the North Cloud mansion feel like a fever dream. I took a seat in a corner booth, the vinyl sticking to my jeans, and opened the ledger once more. Tatum thought she had grabbed the steering wheel of a luxury yacht. What she didn't understand was that the luxury was an illusion maintained by a complex web of personal guarantees and interlocking liabilities. In my father's final years, he had realized the industry was changing. The old ways of scrap and haul were being strangled by new federal regulations. He hadn't just died of old age. He had died of the stress of trying to keep the business afloat without letting the family see the cracks. When I took over, I realized the only way to save the core legacy was to separate the family assets from the business risks. But Tatum had been greedy. She didn't want the protected family trust I had tried to build. She wanted the empire. She had spent months working with a rogue clerk at the county office and Callum's legal team to reclassify our holdings. They thought they were being clever, moving the titles of the mansion and the offshore accounts into her name as part of a preemptive strike before the divorce. What they hadn't realized was that by moving those titles, they triggered a cross-default clause in the private loans my father had taken from a group of very aggressive, very thorough private equity investors. By taking the assets, she had effectively inherited the poison pill. The mansion wasn't just a house anymore. It was the primary collateral for a debt that exceeded its market value by nearly $2 million. The moment the change in ownership was registered without the lender's consent, which it was, thanks to her back-alley legal maneuvers, the entire debt became due immediately. I watched a seagull fight the wind outside the diner window. I could almost see the scene at the house. The black SUVs wouldn't be the police. They would be the recovery agents for the equity group. They don't care about divorce decrees or who rightfully owns the property. They only care about the ledger. And according to the ledger, Tatum had fought so hard to forge, she was the one holding the empty bag. My phone buzzed again. It was a text from Beckett this time. Dad Callum is gone. He took his bags and left in the Porsche. Mom is hysterical. The power just went out. Please just come get us. We didn't mean what we said. I stared at the screen until it went dark. The words, "we didn't mean it," felt like paper-thin shields against the reality of their actions. They had stood in the rain and told me I was dead to them. They had traded a father for a trip to Europe and a car they didn't earn. The pain of it was still there, a dull ache behind my ribs, but it was overshadowed by a cold, hard truth. Some lessons can only be learned in the dark. If I went back now, I would only be teaching them that betrayal has no consequences. I would be feeding the very entitlement that had turned them into people I didn't recognize. I ordered a plate of eggs and toast. The waitress, a woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read, Marnie, smiled at me as she poured more coffee. "You look like you've walked 100 miles today, honey," she said. "Feels more like 1,000, Marnie," I replied. "Well, the good news is the road only goes forward from here. You look like a man who's finally figured out which way is north." She was right. For years, I had been the anchor for a ship that was determined to sink. I had exhausted myself, trying to keep everyone above water, only to have them try to drown me the moment they thought they saw a better boat. Now the anchor was cut. I was drifting, yes, but I was also light. As I ate, I began to plan. I wasn't going to disappear forever, but I wasn't going to be Nash of North Cloud anymore. I had enough in my private account to move inland, maybe toward the mountains of Montana or the high deserts of Idaho. I wanted a place where the air didn't smell like wet scrap metal and the people didn't look at you as a walking bank account. I wanted to build something small, something real. I thought about my father. He'd lived his whole life in that yard surrounded by the discarded remnants of other people's lives. He'd taught me that everything has a value, even if it looks like junk. "You just have to look for the heart of the machine, Nash," he'd say, his hand stained with oil. "The rest is just noise." I had forgotten that. I had let the noise of Tatum's world drown out the heart of my own. The afternoon began to fade into a bruised purple twilight. I paid my bill, leaving a tip that made Marnie's eyes widen, and walked back to the truck. The air was getting colder, the salt spray from the ocean stinging my cheeks. I sat in the driver's seat and turned on the radio, flipping through the stations, until I found a low, bluesy guitar track that matched the rhythm of the waves. I took one last look at the phone. 50 missed calls, 26 texts. A voicemail from Tatum, her voice high and shrill, accusing me of sabotage and criminal negligence. She was already looking for someone to blame, unable to accept that her own hand had pulled the trigger on her downfall. She would spend the next few years in courtrooms and deposition rooms, fighting a battle she had already lost the moment she chose greed over loyalty. I reached out and did something I should have done years ago. I turned the phone off. The screen went black, reflecting the dim light of the dashboard. The silence that followed was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. It wasn't the silence of the grave. It was the silence of a blank page. I drove along the coast road, the headlights of the Ford, cutting a twin path through the gathering mist. I wasn't running away anymore. I was moving toward a version of myself I hadn't seen since I was 20 years old. I felt the weight of the wedding ring on my finger, a piece of gold that had become a shackle. I slowed the truck as I crossed a bridge over a deep, churning inlet. I rolled down the window, the freezing air rushing in, and pulled the band off my finger. It felt lighter than I expected. I didn't hesitate. I tossed it into the dark. I didn't listen for the splash. I just rolled the window back up, feeling the heater kick in against my frozen skin. The road began to wind upward away from the coast and into the thick, ancient forests that bordered the mountains. The tall firs stood like sentinels, their branches heavy with the moisture of the day. I felt a sense of belonging here, among things that grew slowly and didn't care about the drama of men. I found a small family-owned motel tucked behind a grove of cedars. It wasn't on any of the major maps, just a quiet spot for travelers who wanted to be left alone. I parked the truck in the back away from the road and walked to the office. The floorboards creaked under my weight, a solid grounding sound. After checking in, I didn't go straight to bed. I stood on the small wooden balcony of my room, looking out over the dark silhouette of the mountains. The stars were beginning to poke through the clouds, sharp and cold. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished brass key. It was the key to my father's old cabin in the Bitterroot Valley, a place Tatum had never visited because it didn't have high-speed internet or a heated pool. She didn't even know we still owned it. It was the one piece of land I had kept entirely off the North Cloud books, a gift from my father on my wedding day, that I'd kept secret almost as if I knew I'd need a lifeboat one day. The cold began to seep through my shirt, making me shiver, but I didn't go inside. I stood there, breathing in the scent of pine and damp earth, letting the quiet settle into the cracks of my soul. I thought about Beckett and Lennox. One day when the dust settled, and they were forced to face the world without the safety net of my hard work, maybe they would find their way to me. But they wouldn't find the man they could walk over. They would find a man who knew his own worth. Until then, they would have to learn what it meant to live with the choices they'd made in the rain. I turned back toward the room, the dim yellow light from the bedside lamp spilling onto the porch. As I stepped over the threshold, the old wood groaned, and I felt a sudden sharp pang of something I hadn't felt in 15 years. A quiet, terrifying spark of hope that felt like a match being struck in a dark cavern. I closed the heavy oak door behind me, the latch clicking into place with a definitive metallic thud that echoed through the small, silent room. The shadows of the cedar trees outside my window stretched long and jagged across the linoleum floor, resembling the teeth of a saw. I didn't turn on the overhead light. The low amber glow from the bedside lamp was enough to keep the ghosts at bay. My hand, still tingling from the cold of the balcony, reached for the manila envelope I'd carried from the cemetery. The edges were frayed, stained with North Cloud mud and salt spray, but the documents inside remained the only physical tether to the life I had just severed. I spread them across the quilt, not with the frantic energy of a victim, but with the cold, surgical precision of a man who was finally reading the fine print of his own execution. Tatum had always been a master of optics. She understood the power of a well-timed smile and the strategic use of a designer suit. But she had never spent a single day in the yard during a heavy winter when the machines froze and the margins thinned to the width of a razor blade. She didn't understand that wealth isn't just about what you own, it's about what you owe, and more importantly, who holds the keys to the pressure valves. In the quiet of this mountain motel, the rising action of my life felt like a distant, chaotic hum. I had allowed them to believe they were outsmarting me, letting them move pieces on a board they didn't realize I had built. I pulled a single sheet of paper from the stack, a personal guarantee for a cleanup bond on the south sector of the yard. Tatum had signed it 6 months ago, convinced by Callum that it was a formality to transfer the land into her holding company. She didn't realize that the south sector sat on an old industrial drainage site that was currently under investigation by the EPA. By putting her name on that deed, she hadn't just taken the land. She had volunteered to be the primary target for a multi-million-dollar environmental lawsuit. The climax of their betrayal at the funeral had been designed to break me, but it had actually been my liberation. They had snatched the poisoned chalice from my hand and started celebrating before they'd even taken a sip. My mind wandered back to the kids. Beckett's texts were becoming more frequent, a digital trail of breadcrumbs leading back to a home that no longer existed. Mom is selling her jewelry, Nash. Callum's car was towed. Why are you doing this? The why was the easiest part. I wasn't doing anything. I was simply stopping the work I had done to shield them. I had spent 15 years being the buffer between my family and the harsh realities of the world my father had built. Now I was simply stepping aside and letting the momentum of their own greed carry them over the cliff. I spent the night working, not on logistics or shipping, but on the final stage of my father's legacy protocol. It was a series of digital triggers that would release the full audit of North Cloud's liabilities to the relevant authorities the moment my personal accounts reached a certain threshold of inactivity. I wasn't being malicious. I was being thorough. By 4 a.m., the mountain air had turned into a sharp, crystalline frost that coated the window pane. I wasn't looking for revenge. Revenge implies that I still care enough to want to hurt them. This was something else. This was justice by gravity. I was just the man who had stopped holding up the world. I stood up and walked to the small kitchenette brewing a pot of the motel's generic coffee. I realized then that the wealth Tatum had stolen was never the point. The point was the work. The point was the grit. She had taken the shiny shell and left me with the core, and in the process, she'd forgotten that the shell can't survive without the engine. I finished the coffee, feeling the heat settle in my stomach. I packed the papers back into the envelope, but this time I didn't hide them in my bag. I walked over to the small fireplace in the corner of the room, a rustic stone hearth that looked like it had seen a century of winters. I knelt down and struck a match. The flame caught the edge of the petition for dissolution of marriage first. One by one, I fed the remnants of my old life into the fire. The photos of the mansion, the property deeds, the bitter letters from Tatum's attorneys, they all became nothing more than ash and light. When only the glowing embers remained, I stood up. I grabbed my coat and my father's brass key. I didn't need the motel room anymore. The cabin in the valley was waiting a place built of cedar and stone, hidden away from the world of ledgers and lies. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I saw a single missed notification on my dashboard's synced display. It was a voicemail from Tatum. I didn't play it. I simply hit delete and watched the icon vanish. I drove toward the high pass as the truck's engine singing a low, steady song as it climbed. I pulled over at the scenic overlook, the wind whipping around the cab of the truck. I stepped out and looked down at the winding road I'd just climbed. I reached into the bed of the truck and pulled out a heavy, rusted toolbox that had belonged to my father. I picked up a heavy ball-peen hammer, feeling the perfect balance of it in my hand. I wasn't a victim. I wasn't a ghost. I was a builder. And it was time to start on the foundation. I turned back to the truck, the wind catching my hair, and as I climbed into the seat, my hand brushed against the cold, smooth metal of the ignition. I didn't look at the rearview mirror as I pulled back onto the road, the tires gripping the asphalt with a newfound aggression. The steering wheel felt solid, an extension of my own arms, as I navigated the winding descent into the Bitterroot Valley. The aggressive hum of the tires against the pavement was the only heartbeat I needed. As the sun fully breached the peaks, the world below transformed into a tapestry of deep greens and burning golds, a stark contrast to the sterile gray betrayal of Seattle. My father's old cabin sat at the end of a dirt track that time had tried its best to reclaim, huddled among ancient pines like a well-kept secret. I pulled the Ford to a stop, the engine clicking as it cooled in the mountain air. Stepping out, I didn't see a ruin. I saw a beginning. The porch creaked under my boots, a welcoming groan that felt more honest than any "I love you" Tatum had uttered in the last decade. I slid the brass key into the lock, and with a firm twist, the door gave way, releasing the scent of cedar-old paper and a life that had been waiting for me to reclaim it. I spent the first few hours moving with a purpose that had nothing to do with profit margins. I cleared the dust, opened the heavy shutters to let the light pour across the floorboards, and started a fire in the fieldstone hearth. It was manual labor, the kind that makes your back ache, but clears your mind of the toxins. By mid-afternoon, the cabin was breathing again. I sat on the porch, a cup of strong black coffee in my hand, and finally allowed myself to look at my phone one last time. The screen was a graveyard of desperate messages. Tatum's final text wasn't a threat anymore. It was a plea. "Nash, please. The bank took the furniture. The kids are staying in a motel. Callum blocked my number. I don't know how to handle the EPA auditors. Just tell them you're still part of the company. Please, for the sake of our life together." I looked out at the valley where a herd of elk was moving slowly across the meadow. Our life together had been a curated exhibit of greed, and she was finally being forced to pay the admission fee. I didn't feel joy at her suffering. That would mean she still had power over my emotions. I felt the profound, quiet satisfaction of a man watching a storm pass from behind a thick glass window. She had wanted the crown. Now she had to deal with the weight of the rubble. Beckett and Lennox had sent a joint video message. I pressed play, watching their faces, pale, tear-streaked, and devoid of the arrogance they had worn at the funeral. "Dad." Beckett started, his voice cracking. "We messed up. We were stupid. We thought things would just stay the same. We're sorry. Please tell us where you are. We want to come home." I sighed, the steam from my coffee rising into the cold air. They didn't want home. They wanted the safety net. They wanted the man who fixed everything. But the man who fixed everything had been buried in the mud alongside his father. I typed out a single response to the group chat, the last words they would get from me for a long time. The house was never the home. The money was never the man. You chose a name that meant something in the city. Now find out what that name is worth when the lights go out. Don't look for me. Look for yourselves. Maybe you'll find someone worth knowing. I blocked the numbers. I took the SIM card out of the phone, snapped it in half, and watched the plastic shards fall into the tall grass. The digital tether was gone. As the weeks turned into months, the Nash of Seattle became a legend, a cautionary tale whispered in the boardrooms of scrap metal empires. They said I had vanished with millions. They said I had burned it all down out of spite. They couldn't understand that I hadn't taken a cent more than what was mine. I had simply stopped being the glue holding their lies together. I started a small workshop in the valley repairing vintage machinery for the local ranchers. My hands were always stained with oil, now my skin tanned by the high-altitude sun. I wasn't a mogul. I was a mechanic. And for the first time in 15 years, when I looked in the mirror, I recognized the man looking back. One evening as I was closing up the shop, a young man pulled up in a beat-up truck, looking for a part for an old harvester. He looked tired, overworked, but his eyes were bright, with a fierce kind of determination. "Hard work, isn't it?" I asked, handing him the greased gear. "It's the only kind that counts, sir," he replied, wiping his brow. "My old man told me that if you don't build it yourself, you don't really own it." I smiled, a genuine, deep-seated feeling that warmed my chest. Your old man was a smart man. I watched him drive away, the dust settling in the twilight. I walked back to the cabin, the porch light a small, steady beacon against the vast, dark silhouette of the mountains. I had lost a fortune, a family, and a kingdom. But as I sat by the fire that night, listening to the wind howl through the pines, I realized I had won the only thing worth keeping. I had won the right to be silent. I had won the right to be free. The North Cloud legacy was a pile of rusted iron and broken promises. But here in the Bitterroot, I was building something that wouldn't break. I was building a life made of dirt cedar and the quiet, unbreakable strength of a man who had walked away from the fire and realized he wasn't the one who burned. Author's note and audience interaction. Nash chose to let his family face the consequences of their own choices. It's a harsh ending, but some betrayals cut too deep for a simple apology to fix. What do you think? Did Nash do the right thing by cutting them off completely, to teach them the value of loyalty? Or should he have stepped in to save his children once they realized their mistake? The gray area is Tatum, the only villain here, or was Nash's poison pill revenge too cold-blooded? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.